Hi, I'm Nathan. These Karens thought their attitude made them untouchable. Found out the hard way that their arrogance always comes with the ultimate price. From an entitled woman refusing to leave an active pickleball court, to a smug resort guest ignoring heat warnings just to keep tanning, ending her vacation in the craziest way possible. It was April 18, 2016, at a public pickleball court in Mesa, Arizona. Several regular players had arrived that morning for their usual games. The courts were open to everyone, and a small crowd had already gathered around the playing area. Among them was a woman many players recognized because disputes seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her name was Elena Ridge, a 58-year-old administrative assistant. She spent most mornings at the courts and had become known for acting as though she managed them. Years earlier, she created a laminated sign-up sheet and encouraged players to use it before entering a court. Although it had no official approval, many newcomers followed it because they assumed she had authority. Over time, she added more rules and regularly told people when they could play and how long they could stay. Not everyone accepted her role. Some longtime players had grown frustrated with her constant involvement in matters that did not concern her. Elena, however, continued treating the courts as though they needed her supervision. That morning, a group of retirees arrived for a standing game they had played together for years. Elena approached them and informed them they could not use the court because they had not signed her sheet. The group reminded her that the courts were public and that her schedule was not official. They entered the court anyway and began preparing for their game. Instead of walking away, Elena followed them onto the playing surface. She continued arguing and insisted that she would personally settle the dispute. The disagreement attracted attention from nearby players and spectators. Since similar confrontations had happened before, several people began recording with their phones. Elena moved toward the center of the court and refused to leave. Players repeatedly asked her to step aside so they could begin. She remained in place and continued explaining why everyone should follow her rules. Several minutes passed without progress. Some players tried speaking with her calmly. Others suggested contacting park staff. Honestly, it was probably the smartest thing anyone said that day. By that point, the argument had already gone much further than it ever needed to. While waiting for the staff, several players on the far side of the court exchanged soft warm-up shots. They stayed well away from Elena and continued asking her to move. She refused and held her position near the middle of the court. During one exchange, a returned ball unexpectedly traveled toward her location. The ball struck the side of her head. Witnesses later reported that she appeared startled and immediately turned while taking several quick steps backward. As she moved, she failed to notice the lower cord attached to the net. Her foot caught the cord. She lost her balance and fell backward onto the hard court surface, striking the back of her head. Players immediately stopped and rushed to help while others called emergency services. There are so many moments in this story where Elena could have simply stepped away. I keep thinking about how different the outcome might have been if she had decided that proving a point wasn't worth the fight. Emergency responders transported Elena to a hospital, but she later died from her injuries. And just like that, what had been a dispute over a pickleball court turned into a fatal emergency in a matter of seconds. The investigation determined that the ball strike startled Elena, causing her to move backward and become tangled in the net cord. Authorities concluded that the fatal injury resulted from the back of her head striking the court surface during the fall. No wrongdoing was found by any of the other players. Elena turned a disagreement into a confrontation that never needed to happen. The next story follows someone who was equally determined to prove she knew best. It was September 7, 2018, at a residential construction site in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Workers were building the frame of a new house in a neighborhood where construction had been taking place for several weeks. The crew was carrying materials between different sections of the property when a familiar neighbor approached the site once again. Her name was Prue Fleet, a 52-year-old retail supervisor who lived nearby. Workers knew her well because she frequently stopped to comment on the project. Prue often believed she knew the right answer to almost every problem she saw. Whenever she watched the crew work, she seemed convinced that the job could be done better, faster, or smarter if people followed her advice instead. Over time, workers became accustomed to her visits. She would stand near the edge of the property and point out things she believed were wrong. Sometimes she criticized how materials were handled. Other times, she questioned decisions made by the crew. Most workers ignored the remarks and continued with their tasks. They had heard similar complaints before and usually preferred not to argue. What made Prue different different from other neighbors was that she rarely presented her opinions as suggestions. She often spoke as though her ideas were unquestionably correct. The longer the project continued, the more confident she seemed in her belief that she understood construction work better than the people actually performing it. I have always found it strange when someone assumes they know more than the people who do a job every day. Confidence can be useful, but only when it is backed up by real experience. On that day, Prue crossed onto the active work site and walked toward a group of workers installing framing materials. A supervisor informed her that visitors were not allowed inside the work area and asked her to leave. Instead, she continued toward the crew. Several workers later reported that Prue immediately began criticizing their methods and explaining how she believed the work should be done. Crew members attempted to end the discussion and return to work, but Prue continued arguing. As more workers and contractors noticed the confrontation, Prue pointed toward a pneumatic nail gun that had been set down nearby and insisted the task was simple. Workers repeatedly told her not to touch the equipment. She ignored them. Determined to prove her point, Prue picked up the nail gun and carried it toward a partially framed wall. Now remember, nobody challenged Prue to prove herself. The demonstration was entirely her idea. Holding the nail gun, Prue continued explaining how simple the task supposedly was. She positioned herself near the wall and pressed the front of the tool against a piece of framing lumber. Workers again warned her to stop. Moments later, her finger contacted the trigger. The nail entered the lumber as intended. Several workers immediately told her to put the tool down, but Prue continued talking while holding it. Witnesses later reported that she appeared more focused on proving her point than on handling the equipment safely. Instead of setting the tool aside, she lowered it against the front of her body while continuing to argue with the crew about how the work should be done. During the movement, the contact tip of the nail gun was pressed against her upper chest. Her finger remained on the trigger, and the tool discharged unexpectedly. The nail struck her at close range. She immediately dropped the tool and collapsed. Workers rushed to assist her while emergency responders were called. Witnesses later provided highly consistent descriptions of the incident. Physical evidence at the scene matched their accounts of what had occurred. Prue was transported to a hospital but died shortly afterward from her injuries. There's a huge difference between understanding something and believing you understand it. Unfortunately, Prue learned that difference in the worst possible way. Investigators examined the nail gun and found no defects. The investigation concluded that Prue's fatal injury occurred when she unintentionally discharged the tool while handling it herself. No findings were made against the construction crew, and the worksite resumed normal operations after the investigation was completed. Prue ignored the people around her and decided to demonstrate something she didn't fully understand. What comes next starts with a simple argument and a decision made out of pure stubbornness. It was October 22, 2014, at a farmer's market in Eugene, Oregon. Among the booths was a stand offering wild mushrooms that had been collected and identified by experienced foragers. What began as a disagreement over prices at that stand would eventually lead to a tragedy that unfolded over several days. The woman at the center of the story was Maricar Clancy, a 49-year-old bookkeeper. She was known among friends and family for being extremely careful with money. Maricar disliked paying more than she believed something was worth, and she often challenged sellers when she thought prices were too high. That morning, she stopped at the mushroom stand hoping to buy ingredients for a future meal. Instead of making a purchase, she began questioning the prices. The vendor explained that identifying wild mushrooms required training, experience, and careful inspection. Witnesses later recalled that Maricar did not accept the explanation. She believed the sellers were using fear to justify higher prices and insisted that the mushrooms should cost less. The discussion grew louder as more shoppers noticed what was happening. Maricar continued arguing while the vendor attempted to explain the dangers of misidentifying wild mushrooms. Eventually, market staff intervened and asked her to leave the area. Witnesses later remembered that Maricar walked away frustrated and determined not to spend money on the mushrooms. By this point, the argument wasn't really about mushrooms anymore. It had become a matter of pride, and pride has a way of pushing people toward decisions they normally wouldn't make. Later that day, Maricar traveled to a wooded section of a public park. She carried a basket and a field guide containing photographs and descriptions of different mushroom species. Her goal was simple. If vendors could gather mushrooms themselves, she believed she could do the same and avoid paying market prices. As she searched through the woods, several local residents noticed what she was doing. According to later accounts, they warned her to be careful because dangerous mushrooms grew in the area. Some explained that poisonous varieties could closely resemble edible ones. Marikar ignored the warnings. She spent hours collecting mushrooms that appeared similar to the photographs in her guidebook. She focused mainly on visual similarities and relied on her own judgment. By the time she finished, her basket contained several different specimens. Unknown to her, some of the mushrooms she selected were death caps, a highly poisonous species responsible for many fatal poisonings. No experienced forager reviewed her collection. No expert confirmed her choices. Marikar never sought a second opinion before taking the mushrooms home. Back at home, she cleaned the mushrooms and prepared them for a meal. A family member reportedly questioned whether she was certain about her identification. Marikar remained confident and moved forward with cooking. I keep thinking about that moment at home when her family member questioned the mushrooms. Most people would have paused and checked again. Marikar treated that warning the same way she treated every other warning she received that day. After eating the meal, Marikar initially appeared fine. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and there was no immediate reason to suspect anything was wrong. However, after many hours had passed, she began experiencing severe symptoms. Family members became concerned as her condition worsened and sought medical help. Over the following days, doctors worked to determine what had caused the illness. Specialists examined the remaining mushrooms from Marikar's collection. Testing eventually confirmed the presence of death caps among the specimens she had gathered in the park. Despite medical treatment, her condition continued to deteriorate. Marikar died in the hospital several days later. Investigators reviewed the circumstances surrounding the poisoning. Witnesses from both the farmer's market and the woodland area described warning her about the risks of collecting wild mushrooms without proper knowledge. Toxicology findings confirmed fatal mushroom poisoning, and experts traced the poisonous mushrooms directly to those she had personally selected. Authorities found no evidence of foul play. The investigation concluded that the poisoning resulted from mushrooms Marikar gathered, identified, prepared, and consumed herself. The same expertise she had dismissed during the argument at the market ultimately became the key factor used to identify the source of the poisoning. Investigators determined that her death could be traced directly back to the decision she made after refusing to pay for professionally identified mushrooms, linking the fatal outcome to the choice she made while trying to prove she knew better. We've got two more shocking stories of Karen Arrogance ending in ways no one saw coming. So hit that subscribe button if you want to see how entitlement can turn a bad decision into a fatal mistake. It was March 12, 2022, on an interstate freeway near Dallas, Texas. Traffic was moving steadily that afternoon. Among the vehicles on the road was a rideshare car carrying a passenger on what should have been a routine trip home. The passenger was Candace Burrell, a 41-year-old sales representative who traveled frequently for work. Because she used rideshare services so often, she paid close attention to her account rating. People who knew her said she took ratings personally. A lower score felt less like feedback and more like an insult. Candace often became upset when she believed she had been treated unfairly and frequently looked for someone to blame. People who knew her said small disagreements that most passengers would ignore sometimes stayed on her mind for days. Drivers who had interacted with her in the past described her as argumentative and prone to taking minor issues personally. The trip began normally. During the ride, Candace checked her account and noticed that her rating remained lower than she believed it should be. She immediately began questioning the driver about how ratings worked and whether drivers could affect a passenger's score. The driver gave short responses while focusing on traffic. Candace continued pressing the issue and repeatedly leaned forward from the back seat. What began as a simple question slowly turned into an argument that neither side seemed able to end. I can understand being annoyed by a bad rating. Nobody likes feeling judged. But getting home safely matters a lot more than a number on a screen. As the conversation continued, Candace became increasingly frustrated. Investigators later determined that she wanted access to information on the driver's phone because she believed it might explain her rating. The driver refused. Candace removed her seatbelt and leaned forward between the front seats. Dashcam footage later showed that she was no longer sitting properly in the rear passenger area. What surprises me is how quickly this stopped being about the rating itself. At some point, Candace seemed more focused on winning the argument than on getting home safely. She then reached toward the dashboard and grabbed the driver's phone from its mount. The distraction lasted only moments, but it was enough. The vehicle drifted from its lane. The driver attempted to correct its path, but the corrections caused the vehicle to cross lanes and move toward a roadside barrier. Within seconds, the vehicle struck the barrier, spun, and collided with a roadside structure. Airbags deployed as the crash came to a stop. Several motorists who witnessed the collision later reported seeing the vehicle weave unexpectedly just before impact. Many initially believed the driver was dealing with a sudden emergency inside the vehicle. Emergency responders arrived quickly and found both occupants injured. The driver survived with serious injuries. Candace suffered catastrophic trauma. Investigators determined that because she had removed her seatbelt and was leaning forward between the front seats, she was thrown into the dashboard and center console when the vehicle struck the barrier. The driver remained properly restrained, allowing the seatbelt and airbags to absorb much of the crash force. Candace was out of position and unrestrained, causing her to experience far more severe injuries during the collision. A rideshare trip is one of the most ordinary parts of modern life. That is exactly why this ending feels so shocking. Something routine became deadly because one person refused to let an argument go. Candace was transported to a nearby hospital, where she was later pronounced dead from her injuries. Investigators reviewed dashcam footage, witness statements, and physical evidence from the scene. The video captured Candace reaching forward and removing the phone from the dashboard mount only seconds before the loss of control. Crash reconstruction matched the footage, and no mechanical defects were found. No evidence suggested the driver had acted negligently. The rideshare company cooperated with the investigation, and the case was closed as a fatal crash caused by passenger interference. Candace allowed a minor frustration to take control of an ordinary situation. Sharon's story is different because the consequences didn't arrive all at once. It was July 29, 2019, at a resort hotel in Clearwater, Florida. Guests were spending the day around the pool, the beach, and the spa. Inside a quieter section of the resort was a tanning facility available to hotel guests. Over several days, one guest had become a familiar face there. Her name was Sharon Bourne, a 46-year-old real estate agent. Sharon took great pride in maintaining a dark tan throughout the year. Friends described her as someone who cared deeply about her appearance and disliked being told what she could or could not do. During her vacation, she spent a large amount of time using the tanning facility because she wanted to return home with an even darker tan. From the beginning of her stay, employees explained the recommended limits for tanning sessions. Signs posted throughout the area displayed the same information. Staff members also reminded guests to drink water, allow recovery time between sessions, and avoid excessive exposure. Sharon disagreed with those recommendations. According to employees, she argued that paying guests should be free to use the facilities however they wanted. She complained that the limits were unnecessary and insisted that the risks were being exaggerated. Other guests overheard several of these conversations during the week. As the days passed, Sharon continued returning to the tanning facility. Employee records later showed a pattern of repeated use beyond recommended schedules. Staff documented multiple warnings and noted that she had been advised several times to slow down, stay hydrated, and allow her body time to recover. I've stayed at places like this before, and one thing I've noticed is that staff usually do not keep repeating the same warning unless there is a reason behind it. By the morning of July 29th, Sharon had already used the tanning facility earlier in the day. Despite that, she returned once more later that afternoon. Sharon entered one of the rooms and began another session. The equipment functioned normally. The automatic timer ended the session exactly as designed. Surveillance records later showed no indication of any equipment problem or malfunction. Investigators later determined that Sharon had been repeatedly exposing herself over multiple days while becoming increasingly dehydrated. Medical records showed she had not been consuming enough fluids despite spending extended periods in the tanning facility. The physical stress on her body had been building throughout her stay. After the session ended, Sharon remained inside the tanning area rather than leaving immediately. Surveillance footage later showed that she appeared unsteady as she exited the tanning bed and sat down in a nearby waiting area. Most emergencies happen so fast that people never see them coming. This one was different because the warning signs had been building for days. A short time later, Sharon suffered a severe medical crisis. Investigators later concluded that prolonged dehydration had caused a dangerous electrolyte imbalance. Combined with repeated heat exposure, the condition contributed to heat stroke and triggered a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. Alone in the spa area, Sharon collapsed before she could seek help. Within minutes, an employee conducting a routine walkthrough noticed that she was unresponsive and immediately called for emergency assistance. Staff members began first aid while waiting for paramedics to arrive. Emergency responders transported Sharon to a nearby hospital where doctors began intensive treatment. Although medical teams restored her heartbeat, the effects of heat stroke and the cardiac event had already caused severe complications. Despite extensive efforts by doctors, Sharon died later from those complications. The final review found no evidence of foul play. Authorities determined that repeated overexposure, dehydration, and the resulting heat-related complications were the primary factors that led to Sharon's collapse. Investigators concluded that the danger was never hidden from her. Every safeguard functioned as intended, yet none could protect her from the consequences of the choices she continued to make.